My son said, "You will get nothing from Dad's will. $84 million. What he didn't know was that I already owned it all. It's a peculiar thing, sweetheart, to sit at your own husband's funeral and feel as though you've stumbled into the wrong gathering. From the moment I stepped through the chapel doors, I knew this wasn't going to be a farewell for Patrick. It was going to be a presentation. My son had arranged everything. Not once did he ask me what Patrick would have wanted or even what I might prefer. The flowers were perfectly symmetrical arrangements of white lilies, tall and stiff as soldiers. A string quartet played slow, neat pieces that sounded more like an art gallery opening than the goodbye to a man who once banged his hands on the steering wheel while singing along to old country music. The guests filed in wearing solemn expressions, their voices lowered not in grief but in calculation. I could hear the numbers they traded in whispers like gossip at a bridge table. 84 million, one man murmured. That's what they're saying the Sloane Empire's worth now. There was more talk about Patrick's company than about Patrick himself. Not one mention of his clumsy waltz in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. No remembering the way he burned toast every Sunday but ate it with a grin anyway. He had been a man of imperfections and warmth, yet here, he was reduced to neat figures and market valuations. Patrick would have hated it. He'd always said funerals should be messy. People should weep openly, tell bad jokes, forget their umbrellas and huddle under strangers' coats. It's supposed to be real, he once told me. If it's polished, it's not grief, it's theater. And this funeral, oh, it was polished to a mirror shine. Not a thing out of place. Not a pause for laughter or for someone to gather themselves mid-story. It was timed to the second. Efficient. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded neatly in my lap, but I might as well have been another business associate. My name wasn't in the program, I wasn't asked to speak. I was a fixture, present but unnecessary. After the service, I stepped into the chapel garden. The air was heavy with the perfume of lilies, almost suffocating. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I stood there, watching the last of the black sedans pull away. Folding chairs were being stacked, the coffee urns carried off. Guests had left paper cups with lipstick marks and napkins half crumpled on tables. Not a single person asked if I needed a ride home. I stayed there for a while, hands clasped, staring at the hedge Patrick once pointed out to me. Said it looked like a line of stubborn old men in hats. The thought made me smile for just a moment. Then the sound of footsteps came from behind. My son. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted just so. His face composed as if he were still in the meeting room of some corporate office. He didn't look at me right away. Just reached into his jacket and pulled out a small dark box. "Dad asked me to give you this," he said, his voice even and low like he was delivering a memo. I took it carefully. The weight was almost nothing. Inside, nestled against black velvet, was a tie clip, silver, plain and unfamiliar. Not even one of Patrick's favorites. No note. No letter. No explanation. I turned it over in my hand, looking for an engraving or some mark to tell me why this, of all things, had been chosen as a parting gift. Patrick and I had exchanged notes for decades. Tucked into pockets, slipped into lunch bags, left on pillows. Even during his long stays at the office, I'd find his handwriting waiting for me on a scrap of paper, sometimes with nothing more than a drawn heart or a teasing reminder to buy milk. But this was different. Silent. Opaque. When I looked up to ask what it meant, my son was already turning away, walking back toward the chapel doors. He gave me a polite, almost distracted smile over his shoulder before disappearing inside. I stood there for a moment longer, the tie clip warm in my palm from my grip. I didn't know then why Patrick had chosen it. I didn't know it would come to matter. All I knew was that it felt like a riddle, and I had no idea what the answer might be. 3 days after the funeral, my son came to the house. No warning, no gentle, "How are you holding up, Mom?" Just the sound of his key in the lock and the heavy tread of his shoes in the hallway. He found me in the kitchen, still in my robe, making tea. "Mom," he said, leaning against the doorframe like a landlord about to deliver bad news. "We need to talk about living arrangements." I set my cup down slowly. "Living arrangements?" His gaze traveled around the room, Patrick's chair still in its place, the clock ticking softly above the sink, the faint smell of his aftershave still lingering in the air. Then his eyes came back to mine. "I've decided it's best for you to move into the smaller house on the property, the one by the service drive." I blinked. "The servant's house? It's closer to the staff, easier to maintain, and—" He hesitated for just a moment, then added, "Well, it's more appropriate now. You won't have to deal with all this space. And frankly, you're not going to need the main house anymore." The words landed like stones in my chest. Appropriate now. As though I had suddenly been demoted in my own life. I took a breath. "And what about the estate? Patrick and I—" "There's nothing for you from the inheritance," he said, cutting me off. "Dad took care of things and I've got it handled. You'll be comfortable enough in the other house, and the staff will help you." The way he said comfortable enough made it sound like a mercy, like I was being granted a favor, not evicted from my own home. I didn't argue. Not yet. He told me the move would happen at the end of the week. "It'll be easier if you just let the staff handle the packing," he said, already pulling out his phone to send messages. In the days that followed, the house became a place of whispers and footsteps that didn't belong to me. Strangers carried boxes past me in the hall. I saw Patrick's books being wrapped in paper, his photographs taken off the walls. Some of those things had been ours long before there was a company, long before the millions, long before my son knew what the word empire meant. I swallowed my pride and said nothing. Not when I overheard him telling one of the men to clear out the sentimental junk. Not when I caught him smirking at a cracked picture frame of Patrick and me on our wedding day. Not even when he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said, "You'll have a simpler life now, Mom. No more of this big house to rattle around in." He thought he was winning. I smiled at him when he spoke that way. A small, tight smile that hid the fact that something inside me was already making plans. I'd learned a long time ago that there is power in silence. On the morning of the move, I stood at the top of the grand staircase and watched the men carry the last of the boxes out. The house echoed without the weight of our lives inside it. I could almost hear the ghost of our old laughter in those halls. Patrick's booming voice, my own softer one answering. The servant's house was clean but plain. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, furniture that looked borrowed from storage. The windows faced the service drive instead of the gardens. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and lemon polish. When my son showed me around, he spoke as if he'd done me a kindness. "Everything's arranged. The housekeeper will check in twice a week, and the gardener will keep the path clear." I nodded, keeping my hands clasped in front of me. "Thank you," I said. It was easier to let him think I had accepted my place. That way he wouldn't see me watching, listening, remembering. That night I unpacked alone. I put the kettle on and took the little box with the tie clip out of my handbag. I held it in the lamplight, turning it over, still wondering why Patrick had chosen it. There was no engraving, no hidden message I could find. I set it on the windowsill beside the small table. Something about it kept tugging at my thoughts. And in that quiet, with the streetlight casting a pale glow through the curtains, I made myself a promise. I would not be bitter, not openly. Bitterness is a loud, obvious thing, and it warns the people who deserve to be surprised. I would stay quiet. I would let him believe he had pushed me aside for good. And I would wait. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence is not the same as surrender. It's funny, sweetheart, how people can forget the ground they're standing on was built by someone else's hands. My son, with all his polished confidence, Seemed certain the Sloan Empire had always been solid. But I knew better. I remembered the cracks, the nights we thought it might all collapse. 10 years earlier, the company had been bleeding out. I still remember the day Patrick came home pale as paper, his tie loosened, his shoulders slumped like a man who'd carried something far too heavy. He sat at the kitchen table without taking off his coat. "It's bad," he said finally, his voice low. "We've lost our biggest contract. Creditors are circling. If we can't make payroll next month." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I made us coffee and sat across from him, the smell of burnt toast lingering from breakfast. We didn't talk about vacations or dinner plans anymore. We talked about which bills could wait. "How much?" I asked. He told me. I remember feeling the number in my chest more than hearing it, like an icy hand had pressed right against my ribs. I thought about my jewelry box upstairs, about the car parked in the drive, the one I'd saved for years to buy outright, about the little account my mother had helped me start when I was 19, for emergencies only. By morning I had my answer. I sold it all. The gold bracelet my grandmother left me, the diamond earrings Patrick had given me on our 10th anniversary, the sapphire ring I bought for myself after my first good year at the bakery. The car went next. My pride and joy, the one with the radio that still had to be tuned by hand. I remember the man at the dealership asking, "Are you sure you want to part with her?" I told him, "She's just a car. My husband's business is more important." Patrick didn't argue. He didn't thank me right away either. He was too busy trying to stop the bleeding. But within days, those sales gave him just enough to keep the lights on. That's when I stepped in, not as his wife, but as something I never thought I'd be, a crisis manager. I'd watched him run the company for years, seen the reports, heard the calls. I knew the business as well as anyone in the room, better perhaps because I wasn't blinded by pride. So when Patrick admitted he didn't know how to convince the bank to extend the credit line, I picked up the phone and made the call myself. I set up meetings, reviewed contracts, and renegotiated terms like my life depended on it, because it did. The first month was brutal. I spent my days in an office that had once been a tidy space for hosting clients, now cluttered with stacks of unpaid invoices and letters stamped final notice. I ate lunch at my desk. I learned which vendors could be reasoned with, and which needed reminding that they'd been friends with Patrick for years. I made cuts no one else wanted to make. We sold a property that had been sitting unused, and I found new buyers for inventory that had been gathering dust in the warehouse. When one of our oldest clients hinted at walking away, I drove 3 hours to meet him in person, sat in his kitchen, and convinced him to give us 6 more months. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into growth. Slowly, the Sloan name climbed back. We won new contracts. We expanded into markets Patrick had never considered. And every month the numbers crept higher. Patrick told everyone he'd weathered the storm. But the truth is, I was the one steering us through it. He knew it even if my name wasn't on the office door. One evening, a little over 2 years after the worst of it, he brought home champagne. We sat on the back porch, the summer air warm, the cicadas humming in the trees. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice thick. "I know I never say it enough, but I know what you gave up. I know what you did." I waved it off at the time. "We did what we had to do," I told him. But later, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him in his study making a call to our lawyer. His voice was low, but I caught a few words. "Update the will. Everything in her name, she saved it all." I didn't mention it. Maybe I thought he was just speaking in the heat of gratitude, but part of me filed it away, wondering if he really meant it. And now, 10 years later, living in the servant's house and being told I'd get nothing from the inheritance, I thought about that night. I thought about the jewelry, the car, the hours spent in that cramped office, about every decision that had pulled the company back from the edge. My son had no idea. and for now I intended to keep it that way. If there's one thing I've learned, sweetheart, it's that a will is more than a list of names and numbers. It's a story, and often not the one people think they're living. My son believed the ending was already written. He thought I was a footnote, a closing paragraph in his version of the Sloan legacy. But I knew Patrick better than anyone. And I knew he kept his promises. It was a week after the move to the servant's house when the thought first came to me. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, looking out at the service drive, when I remembered that night on the porch all those years ago. The champagne, the quiet gratitude, and his low voice on the phone to our lawyer. Everything in her name. I'd never asked him about it. At the time I didn't need to. We were together, we were rebuilding, and the business was alive again. But now it felt like something I should have confirmed long ago. The only thing I had from him after the funeral was that tie clip. It sat on the windowsill, catching the light in the mornings, as if it were waiting for me to pay attention. I'd pick it up sometimes, turning it over, tracing its smooth edges, searching for a mark or engraving. There was nothing. Yet it didn't feel random. Patrick wasn't the type to leave a thing like that without reason. One evening, I went through the few boxes I'd insisted on packing myself. Inside a folder of old household bills, I found our lawyer's business card. Bent at the corner but still legible. My fingers hesitated over the phone, but something told me not to call. If my son had as much control over the estate as he thought he did, a simple inquiry might alert him. Instead, I decided to dig quietly. I began by visiting the public records office in town. I told the clerk I needed to confirm a property detail for insurance purposes. She didn't ask many questions, just slid a stack of forms across the counter. My son's name was there, of course, listed as executor. But when I traced the lines carefully, I saw something that made my pulse quicken. Next to the company's official registration, in small neat type, was my name. Sole owner. It didn't make sense. Not if my son's claims were true. That night, I brewed myself a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the record copy beside me, the tie clip in my hand. I kept thinking of Patrick's last months. The way he'd been quieter, more deliberate with his words, more watchful when our son came around. I remembered once finding him at his desk, not working, just staring at an open file before closing it quickly when I walked in. The next day, I decided to visit the bank we'd used for decades. I didn't expect them to tell me much, not without proper proof, but I asked if there were any safety deposit boxes still active under Patrick's name. The teller tapped at her computer, then looked up. "There's one," she said. "Hasn't been opened in over a year." I thanked her and left without pressing further. A small key would be needed, of course, and I didn't have it. But the thought stuck with me. That tie clip, smooth as it was, had a weight that didn't feel entirely solid. I began to suspect there was more to it than met the eye. Still, I didn't push. Not yet. I'd learned patience in those years of rebuilding the company. How to watch, wait, and gather what you needed before making a move. In the meantime, I kept my interactions with my son polite but sparse. When he dropped by to check in, I nodded, smiled faintly, let him believe I was adjusting. He spoke about the business as though it had always been his, as though I'd never sat in the boardroom or negotiated contracts until my voice went hoarse. I let him talk. Inside, though, I was building a picture that told me Patrick had not left me out at all. In fact, it was beginning to look like he had left me everything. But why hide it? Why make it so my son didn't know? I thought back to the months before Patrick died. He'd been friendlier, yes, but also wary. Like a man who had seen something and was quietly putting up walls before anyone noticed. I began to wonder if he'd suspected our son's intentions. And if that tie clip really was just a tie clip, or the first piece in a trail he'd left for me to follow. I set it back on the windowsill and looked out toward the main house, its lights glowing against the dark. My son thought the game was over, but I was beginning to see it had only just begun. If my son's plan was to shrink me down to nothing, he was working hard at it. Life in the servant's house had been meant as a quiet exile, but he didn't stop there. He made sure I knew every day just how far I had fallen in his eyes. Started with little jabs. A raised eyebrow when I asked about the business. A smirk when I wore one of my old dresses. Once, when I mentioned a friend from the board, he chuckled and said, "Mom, that was a long time ago. I don't think anyone even remembers you were involved." But the insults didn't stay small. One afternoon he came by unannounced. I'd been baking bread, the kind Patrick used to love, when he walked in without knocking. He looked around the kitchen like he was inspecting a rental. "You should sell off those old serving pieces," he said, pointing to the silver tray on the counter. "It's not like you have anyone important to entertain anymore." I smiled faintly, not taking the bait. "You know," he went on, "Dad always told me he built the company from scratch. You were just there. Supportive, sure, but—" He let the sentence dangle like an open insult. I nodded, my hand steady on the bread knife. "I'm glad you remember your father's words." Inside, I could feel the anger coil, but I didn't let it show. There's power in letting someone underestimate you. It makes them sloppy. That evening, after he left, I took a small notebook from the drawer and began to write. Every word he said. Every tone, every smirk, every careless dismissal. I added the date and time. Then I tucked the notebook away under a stack of linens in the bedroom. It was a start. A few days later, I got help from an unexpected source. Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, had worked for the Sloanes for nearly 3 decades. She'd been there before the money, before the empire, back when Patrick was still driving his own deliveries. She'd always been loyal to him, and I had a feeling that loyalty didn't die with him. She came to the servant's house one morning under the pretense of bringing fresh towels. "I'm sorry about the change in accommodations," she said, setting them down. I gave her a polite smile. "It's fine. I'm adjusting." She hesitated, then glanced toward the closed door. "I've been hearing some things, Mrs. Sloane. Things about how you're being treated." I tilted my head, curious. "I've known your husband a long time," she said, "and I know he'd want me to look out for you. If you're gathering anything, I can help." I didn't answer right away. But the next time my son came by, I made sure Mrs. Collins was nearby, dusting in the hallway where she could hear every word. And there was plenty to hear. That visit, he told me I should stop pretending I had any say in the company. He said my job now was to enjoy retirement and stay out of the way. I smiled again, made him tea, and let him talk. When he left, Mrs. Collins slipped into the kitchen and handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a list of times and dates she'd overheard him speaking to me like that. She even noted 2 occasions when he'd spoken to staff about getting her to sign something before she changes her mind. From then on, Mrs. Collins became my quiet ally. We developed a system. If my son was on his way over, she'd text me, "Delivery coming," so I could be ready. She made sure to be in the house when he visited, always within earshot. She also started sharing memories of Patrick, little details I hadn't known, like how he'd once told her, "If anything happens to me, make sure my wife knows where the truth is." It made my mind go back to the tie clip on my windowsill. I didn't know yet what Patrick had meant, but the pieces were starting to gather in my hands. In the meantime, the notebook under the linens grew thicker. I added not just my son's words but descriptions of his tone, his posture, even the way he looked at me. If he sent a cutting text, I copied it down and noted the time it was sent. And when Mrs. Collins overheard him say to another employee, "She's harmless, just keep her comfortable until the paperwork's sorted," she wrote it word for word and slipped it into my pocket the next time she saw me. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Not much, but enough to steady my hands when I thought about the future. I didn't confront him. I didn't threaten. I just kept smiling my small tight smile and writing everything down. Because I knew sooner or later I'd need proof. And I was going to have more than enough. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet, unremarkable day you almost forget, until something changes it forever. Mrs. Collins had come over with a basket of laundry from the main house. She said it was left behind in the old rooms, but I suspected she just wanted an excuse to stop by without attracting my son's attention. We made tea and chatted in the little kitchen while I sorted through the folded shirts and socks. She noticed the tie clip sitting on the windowsill. "That Patrick's?" she asked, picking it up. I nodded. "The only thing I got from him after the funeral." She turned it over in her hand. "Strange choice. He wasn't much for tie clips unless it was something special." I told her I'd been thinking the same thing. No engraving, no note, no obvious reason. Just there. Mrs. Collins started to set it down when her hand slipped. The clip hit the edge of the table and popped open. I froze. "Did you see that?" Inside, nestled in the hollow, was a tiny folded piece of paper and an even smaller brass key. My breath caught in my throat. Mrs. Collins and I stared at each other for a long moment before she gently handed it to me. The note was written in Patrick's tidy, deliberate handwriting. Only 6 words. "Bank. Box. You know the one." I did know the one. There was a safe deposit box at our bank, one Patrick had opened years ago, for personal items. I'd forgotten about it in the chaos of his illness, but the moment I saw that key, I remembered the way he'd once told me, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll need this." Mrs. Collins leaned in. "Do you think?" "I think," I said slowly, "Patrick left me something he didn't want anyone else to see." We agreed not to act right away. My son was too attentive when it came to my movements, always asking where I'd been, always finding reasons to check in after I left the property. If he suspected I had anything from Patrick beyond that tie clip, he'd do everything in his power to take it. 2 days later, I went to the bank. I told my son I had a doctor's appointment. He didn't bother to come with me. I think he believed I'd stopped making plans of my own. The woman at the counter recognized me. "Mrs. Sloane, of course. We still have the box on file. If you'll follow me?" In the small private room, I used the tiny brass key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in my ears. Inside was a thick envelope with my name on it. I opened it slowly, my hand steady but my heart pounding. The first thing I saw was a stack of official documents, company registration papers, title deeds, trust agreements. All of them listed me, and me alone, as the sole owner of the Sloane business and its assets. Behind them was a copy of Patrick's will, dated 8 years earlier, long before his final illness, long before my son had wormed his way into control. In clear language, it left everything to me. Not in trust. Not to be managed by. Just to me outright. At the bottom was a letter. "My darling," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm gone, you will need protection. From anyone who might forget how much you've done. You saved this company and you saved me. I will not have anyone take that from you. The papers in this box prove what is yours. Keep them safe until you decide what to do. And remember, silence can be your shield until it becomes your sword." I sat there for a long time, reading it over and over. Patrick had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough to prepare for it. When I returned home, I hid the envelope in the one place my son would never think to look, in the bottom of the old sewing basket my mother had given me, under a tangle of half-finished mending. That evening, I told Mrs. Collins what I'd found. Her eyes widened. "So it's all yours? Every last bit?" I nodded. "And he doesn't know?" "Not yet." She smiled, a small, satisfied smile. "Then we make sure he doesn't find out until you're ready." I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I had the documents, but because now I understood what Patrick had been doing. That tie clip had been his quiet warning. His way of telling me, don't trust what you're being told. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was merely surviving. I was preparing. Once I had that envelope, sweetheart, the whole picture changed. I wasn't just a quiet exile anymore. I was the rightful owner of everything my son thought he controlled. Patrick's words echoed in my head. Silence can be your shield until it becomes your sword. So I kept silent. Every morning I made tea, put on a sweater, and let the day play out as though nothing had changed. When my son stopped by, I smiled politely, asked about the weather, and let him talk about his company. He was growing bolder in his arrogance, thinking I'd been neatly boxed away like an old photo album. He didn't know I was building something in the shadows. Mrs. Collins and I began working more deliberately. We already had my notebook of his insults, but now we made sure to capture them in ways that couldn't be disputed. I bought a small tape recorder, cash from a shop in town where no one knew me, and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan whenever he visited. The first time I played one back, hearing his voice dripping with condescension, I knew it would be useful one day. Mrs. Collins helped from her side. She quietly asked other staff members if they'd ever been told not to bother Mrs. Sloan, or to keep her out of sight during meetings. Several remembered specific comments and agreed to give statements if needed. We also went through old files Patrick had kept in his study, which my son had carelessly left in boxes in the storage room. In them we found handwritten notes from Patrick praising my role during the company's turnaround. One written to the board said plainly, "My wife's strategic decisions saved us from bankruptcy. We owe our current success to her judgment and sacrifice." Every document went into a growing binder in the sewing basket with the will and ownership papers. The more I collected, the calmer I became. There's a strange peace in knowing you hold the truth in your hands, while someone else confidently spins their lies. One afternoon, while my son was away on a business trip, Mrs. Collins and I walked through the main house under the pretense of checking for personal items I might have forgotten. I lingered in Patrick's study, running my fingers along the bookshelves. On impulse, I pulled out a leather-bound ledger. Inside were detailed meeting notes from the year of the bankruptcy crisis, most in Patrick's handwriting, some in mine. In the margin of one page, Patrick had written, "Update will to reflect her ownership." The date matched the summer he'd called the lawyer from our porch. That ledger went into the basket too. We didn't move too quickly. If we collected too much at once, someone might notice. Instead, we took what we could during normal tasks, meals in the main house, laundry runs, afternoons in the garden. All the while my son grew more careless. He spoke openly about expanding the business, about selling off certain assets before Mom finds out. One day, he even laughed about the servant's house to a guest in front of me, saying, "It's the perfect place to keep her comfortable and out of the way." I smiled then, just as I always did. But inside, I tucked his words neatly into my mental file. By the third month, our binder was nearly full. We had the will naming me as sole heir, official ownership documents for the company, properties, and assets, multiple recordings of his verbal abuse and dismissive comments, statements from staff about his treatment of me, letters and notes from Patrick crediting me with saving the company, the ledger confirming his intent to leave it all to me. I knew it was enough. But timing matters, dear. Just because you have the upper hand doesn't mean you slam it down on the table. You wait until the room is quiet, until everyone's watching, until the other side is sure they've already won. So I waited. I kept my tea warm and my voice soft. I listened to my son's plans for a grand expansion overseas. I watched him take calls, never realizing that the chair he was sitting in, the desk he was leaning on, the company he was running, all of it was mine. And when the time came to strike, I would not raise my voice. I wouldn't have to, because the truth, sweetheart, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be read aloud. It was a rainy Thursday when I decided it was time. The binder was full. The sewing basket was heavy, and my patience had ripened into something sharp. Patrick's words, "Silence can be your shield until it becomes your sword," felt like they were humming in my ears. I called my son and told him I wanted to meet with the estate lawyer to clear up a few questions. He agreed, perhaps thinking he could finally make me sign whatever papers he'd been circling like a hawk. The lawyer's office was all polished wood and quiet carpets. My son arrived first, sitting at the head of the table as though it were his by birthright. He gave me a polite nod when I came in, the kind you'd give a distant relative at a wedding. "Mother," he said, gesturing to the seat at the far end. I set my sewing basket beside me and folded my hands on the table. The lawyer, a man I'd known for years, began with the usual pleasantries before sliding a stack of documents toward my son. "These are the papers for the transfer," the lawyer said. I looked at them, then at my son. "Transfer of what exactly?" "The company assets," he said smoothly, "into my sole control for efficiency. You'll still be taken care of." I smiled, a small knowing smile. "That's generous of you." Then I reached into the sewing basket and set the binder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood made my son's hand pause mid-pen stroke. "I think," I said, opening it to the first page, "we should review the actual ownership before anything is signed." The lawyer's brow furrowed as he read. The first document was Patrick's will, naming me as the sole beneficiary of the company, all properties, and the estate. "This can't be," my son began. "It is," I said gently. "Signed and dated 8 years ago. Filed legally. And not once amended." Next, I laid out the official company registration papers listing me as sole owner. Then the trust deeds, the property titles, the letter from Patrick to the board praising my role in saving the business. The lawyer looked up. "Mrs. Sloan, you're the legal owner of the company and all related assets." I nodded. "Yes, I am." My son's face reddened. This doesn't change anything. You're not capable of." I lifted a hand. "Careful. I brought more." From the back of the binder, I pulled the transcripts of his insults, the printed text messages, the statements from staff, and the audio recordings. One by one, I slid them across the table. The lawyer listened to a short clip, my son's voice clear and dripping with contempt. "She's harmless. Just keep her comfortable until the paperwork's sorted." Silence settled over the room like a heavy quilt. "You've been..." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Your behavior toward your mother could be grounds for serious legal consequences, especially given her ownership position." My son looked between us, his mouth opening and closing without words. The arrogance he'd worn so easily for months was slipping fast, replaced by something I hadn't seen since he was a boy: fear. I closed the binder, the sound neat and final. "Here's what's going to happen," I said calmly. "Effective immediately, you will step down from all positions within the company. I will take direct control of all operations and assets. You will vacate the main house within the week." He started to protest, but I leaned forward just slightly. "Or we can take this to court, where the recordings, statements, and documents will become public record. Your choice." The lawyer didn't speak, but his expression made it clear which option would be wiser. After a long pause, my son sank back into his chair. "Fine," he muttered. "No," I said softly. "Not fine. Final." I gathered the binder and tucked it back into the sewing basket. Then I stood, smoothing my skirt, and looked him in the eye. "Patrick trusted me with this company. I trusted you to be decent. Only one of us kept their promise." I left the office without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped and the air smelled clean, as though the world had been washed and set fresh. Mrs. Collins was waiting in the car. When I got in, she glanced at my face and smiled. "So, it's done," I said. "Everything is mine again." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Patrick would be proud." I looked out the window at the wet streets and thought of the tie clip sitting back on the windowsill. That little silver piece had carried the key literally to my freedom. And now, sweetheart, the game had changed entirely. The morning after the meeting, I stood at the window of the servant's house, looking out at the main house across the lawn. It still looked the same, grand, sprawling, the kind of home people point at from the road, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't a fortress keeping me out anymore. It was a possession, mine to do with as I pleased. By the end of the week, my son was gone from it. He left in the early morning, driving away without a goodbye. Mrs. Collins told me he hadn't even bothered to take all his clothes. The house felt lighter without him, though not enough for me to want to live in it again. I had no intention of keeping any of it. Not the house, not the company, not the cars. Patrick had built his empire for us, and I'd fought to save it, but I had no desire to spend my last years sitting in a boardroom or wandering empty halls. The first step was the company. I called the board together, papers in hand, and announced my decision to sell. There was a ripple of surprise, then a quick undercurrent of interest. Within a month I'd found a buyer. One with deep pockets and a reputation for taking care of their employees. The price was staggering. Tens of millions wired directly into accounts in my name. Next came the properties. The main house, the 2 vacation homes, even the little cottage by the shore Patrick and I had once loved. I sold them all. The Rolls-Royce went to a collector in the city who seemed delighted to pay a small fortune for it. Furniture, art, jewelry. I kept only what truly meant something to me. Mrs. Collins was there every step of the way, handling calls, keeping the process moving, and making sure I was never alone in the presence of anyone who might try to talk me into changing my mind. When the last sale closed, I asked her to come to the kitchen of the servant's house. I had a small envelope waiting on the table. She looked puzzled when I handed it to her. "What's this?" "Your loyalty payment," I said with a smile. She opened it and gasped. "This is..." "It's enough," I said, "for you to do whatever you want for the rest of your life. Travel. Buy a house. Never clean another floor unless it's your own." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she hugged me tight, something she'd never done before. "Patrick would be so proud of you," she whispered. I thought about Patrick a lot in those weeks. About how he'd known me well enough to leave the tie clip, how he'd trusted I'd find my way. I wished I could tell him that I had, and that I'd done it without bitterness, just determination. My son, on the other hand, didn't get a penny. I'd made sure of it. I left a trust fund for the grandchildren, untouchable until they were old enough to manage it themselves. The rest was mine to decide. I didn't call him to explain. I didn't send a letter. I imagine he found out from the lawyer, and perhaps that stung more than any confrontation I could have given him. He had always assumed he'd inherit power, but power is something you have to hold on to, and he'd let it slip right through his fingers. When everything was done, I packed the few things I wanted into 3 suitcases. Clothes, a box of letters from Patrick, and the tie clip. The rest of the money, the properties, the business, they were gone from my hands. And for the first time in a long while I felt light. Mrs. Collins offered to come with me wherever I decided to go, but I told her it was time for both of us to live our own lives. She promised to write, and I believed she would. The day I left, the lawn between the main house and the servant's house was just starting to green after winter. I stood there for a moment watching the sunlight on the grass, then turned away. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom. I'd had the last laugh. Not the loud, mocking kind, but the quiet, certain kind that comes when you've taken back everything that was yours and handed it over only to peace. And with that, I was ready to begin the life Patrick had made sure I could still have. I found my new home almost by accident. It wasn't in any brochure or real estate listing. It was a small weathered house tucked between a curve in the river and the base of a mountain. The drive there wound through pine trees so tall they seemed to scrape the clouds, and when I first stepped out of the car, the only sounds were the rush of water and the wind through the branches. It was nothing like the grand estates Patrick and I had owned. The roof was a little uneven, the porch sagged on one side, and the paint had faded to a soft gray. But the moment I saw it, I knew. This was where I could live the rest of my days in peace. The man selling it was a retired fisherman. He told me the river was full of trout in spring, that the mornings smelled of cedar and the evenings of wood smoke. I bought it that same afternoon, paid in full, and asked if he could leave the old rocking chair on the porch. Moving in was easy. After selling everything, I didn't have much to bring. Just my clothes, Patrick's letters, a few photographs, and the tie clip. That went on the windowsill above the small kitchen sink, where the morning sun caught it. Every time I saw it, I thought of Patrick's quiet planning, his way of protecting me without fanfare. The first few weeks were spent making the place mine. I painted the kitchen a warm cream, planted herbs in clay pots outside the door, and set up a little garden along the back fence. The soil was good, rich and dark, and soon I had rows of tomatoes, carrots, and beans pushing up toward the light. Life settled into a gentle rhythm. I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the river catch the first rays of sun. Sometimes a heron would land in the shallows, standing so still you'd think it was carved from stone. In the afternoons, I baked bread or canned vegetables from the garden. I took long walks along the trails that wound up into the hills. I learned which trees the songbirds liked best, and I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down when the wildflowers bloomed and when the deer came to drink at the riverbank. It was quiet here, but it wasn't lonely. The nearest town was 15 minutes away, and I made friends with the woman who ran the bakery and the fellow who sold fresh honey at the farmer's market. They knew nothing about Patrick's empire, my son's betrayal, or the millions I'd once controlled, and I liked it that way. Mrs. Collins wrote just as she promised. Her letters came once a month, full of news about her travels. Paris in the spring, Italy in the summer. I sent her photos of my garden and the river in all its moods. Glassy and calm in July, roaring and wild in October rains. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I'd think about my son. Not with bitterness, those days were gone, but with a kind of distant sorrow. He had taken himself out of my life as surely as if he'd walked off into another country. I hoped, in some small part of me, that he'd learned something from what happened. But whether he did or not was no longer my concern. What mattered was this. I had my freedom, my peace, and the certainty that I had lived true to myself. One crisp autumn morning, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched the leaves drift down to the river. The tie clip caught the light through the kitchen window, and I thought of Patrick again. He'd known I was strong enough to handle what came after him, but he'd also known I might need a nudge. A quiet reminder that I wasn't powerless. That little silver clip had been his way of saying, "You'll find the key and you'll know what to do." And I had. Now it sat on my windowsill not as a secret but as a symbol. A reminder that even in silence, love can protect you. That sometimes the loudest victory isn't in shouting or gloating, but in living well after the storm has passed. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, listening to the river's steady song. The mountains rose behind me like old guardians, the water ran on before me, and the air smelled of pine and earth. My life had become small in size but vast in peace. And in that quiet place, far from boardrooms and betrayal, I knew I had exactly what I wanted.